On the morning of August 9th, 1988, Ray Feltner turned on the kitchen tap and got a cough of air and a trickle, and then nothing. He had been expecting it. The Monroe County drought of 1988 had been drawing down the water table since June, and he had been watching the well output decline through July. The pressure dropping at the yard hydrant, the recovery time after a heavy barn wash getting longer, the specific hollow sound the pump made when it was working harder than it should to maintain prime. He had been watching the signs, and he had been counting the gallons in the cistern. He drove to the barn. He lifted the red wooden cover on the cistern at the northwest corner of the barn. He dropped a measuring tape on a float down through the access hole. The cistern had 14,000 gallons. He set the cover back on. He went to do the morning chores. His neighbor, Dale Vickers, had been hauling water from the Ellettsville standpipe since August 3rd. 6 days already, 800 gallons per day for his 40 head of beef cattle. The Monroe County Rural Water District standpipe was 12 miles away, and the round trip was 40 minutes in the farm truck with an 800-gallon tank trailer. Dale was making 2 trips a day. He would make 2 trips a day until the rain came, which the forecast did not show arriving until September. Ray's 60 head of cattle drank from the stock tank in the barn lot. The stock tank was fed by a line from the cistern. The cistern collected every drop of rain that fell on the barn roof, approximately 3,200 square feet of metal roofing, and stored it in the brick-lined vault that Amos Feltner had built in the summer of 1922, and that Ray had cleaned and inspected every September for 17 years since taking over the farm. He did not haul a single gallon of water during the 1988 drought. Not one trip to Ellettsville. Not one tank trailer load from the standpipe. 60 head of cattle, a hog operation, and a household. 40 days from August 9th to September 17th, when the first significant rain came. The cistern started with 14,000 gallons and ended with approximately 4,000 gallons, a draw of 10,000 gallons over 40 days, or 250 gallons per day. Amos's brick vault had held through the worst summer Monroe County had seen since 1930. Let me tell you about Amos Feltner, because you need to understand what he saw in 1922 before you can understand what he built. Amos had been farming the Monroe County place since 1914, when he had bought it at age 30 from a neighbor who was retiring. The farm had a dug well, a hand-dug 18-foot shaft lined with fieldstone, the same type of well that most farms in southern Indiana had operated from since the Homestead era. It had served adequately in normal years. In dry years, it served less adequately. In the summer of 1922, one of the drier summers in Monroe County's recorded weather history, it served barely at all. The well yield had dropped to perhaps 30 gallons per hour by mid-July of 1922. Amos's cattle needed approximately 200 gallons per day. At 30 gallons per hour, he could pump perhaps 400 gallons in a working day if he ran the hand pump constantly, which no one could do. He was rationing water to the livestock, running them to the creek when the creek still had flow, and watching the well level drop week by week through a dry July that showed no sign of breaking. He had thought about it the way he thought about any farm problem, not with panic, but with the specific deliberateness of a man who has time to think and intends to use it. He had looked at the barn roof. He had looked at the gutter system. He had looked at the ground beside the barn. He had done a calculation on the back of a feed sack. The barn roof was approximately 3,200 square feet. 1 inch of rain on 3,200 square feet produces approximately 2,000 gallons of runoff. A normal Monroe County year brought 42 inches of rain. Even if only half of that fell during the collection season, 21 inches on 3,200 square feet was 42,000 gallons per year. He did not need 42,000 gallons. He needed a buffer, a stored reserve that could carry his livestock through the next time a summer like 1922 arrived. He needed a structure that could hold it, keep it clean, and give it back under pressure when the well could not deliver. He had started digging in August of 1922, before the drought broke, working in the late afternoon when the heat was lower. He had excavated the 12-foot deep, 10-foot diameter cylinder in 11 days, hauling the soil by wheelbarrow to the field edge. He had ordered brick from the Bloomington Brickworks, 1,400 units, delivered on a wagon over 2 trips, and had laid them himself in the cylindrical form, each course set in Portland cement mortar, the rings of brick stepping slightly inward at the base to follow the excavated shape. He had plastered the interior with a waterproof lime coat mixed to his own recipe, 2 parts lime putty, 1 part Portland cement, river sand, working it smooth with a wooden float from the bottom up. He had built the settling box from flat fieldstone, graded from coarse gravel to fine sand, and had run the clay tile inlet from the barn downspout through it. He had fitted the wooden cover to the concrete collar and had caulked the joint. The cistern had filled with the September rains of 1922. He had watched it fill through the inlet with the specific satisfaction of a man who has solved a problem completely. He had said to his son that fall, Ray's father, then 12 years old, "A farm that cannot hold its rain cannot farm through a dry summer." He had said it once. His son had heard it. Let me tell you about the history of the cistern between 1922 and 1988, because 66 years is a long time, and the cistern's history through those years is the history of how something essential becomes invisible and then becomes essential again. Ray's father had maintained the cistern through his own farming years, cleaning it every September, replacing mortar where it was needed, keeping the settling box clear. He had drilled the new well in 1948, going to 86 feet into the limestone aquifer that underlay the county's geology at depth. The new well was better than the old dug well in every way. More reliable yield, cooler water, no surface contamination risk. The new well became the primary water source for the house and the barn lot. But Ray's father had not abandoned the cistern. He had kept collecting the barn roof runoff, had kept cleaning it in September, had kept using it as a supplemental source for barn washing and garden irrigation. He had told Ray in 1971, when he handed over the farm, "Keep the cistern clean and connected." He had said, "The well is reliable, but the cistern is certain." He had paused. They are not the same thing. Ray had not fully understood the distinction. The well had been reliable for 23 years of his father's farming and showed no sign of being unreliable. The cistern was an old structure that required 4 hours of his time every September and produced water he used primarily to wash down the barn and fill the stock tank in dry spells. It had seemed like a reasonable thing to maintain without being something he thought about much. In 1971, the county health department had sent a notice to farms in Monroe County recommending the abandonment of open-top rainwater cisterns under the county's updated groundwater protection guidelines. The notice had cited contamination risks from surface water intrusion, bird and rodent access through deteriorated covers, and the difficulty of meeting drinking water standards in an unfiltered surface collection system. The notice was informational rather than mandatory. Ray had read it and filed it. Dale Vickers had filled in his cistern that fall. He had told Ray, the county says they're a health risk, and mine is just sitting there not being used. I need the space for the tractor. He had poured 8 tons of gravel down the hole and capped it with concrete. He had said, "You should do the same." Ray had said, "I'll keep mine." Dale had shaken his head and driven home on his tractor. Ray had kept the cistern. He had inspected the cover, found it sound, and replaced the inlet screen that fall. He had cleaned it the following September and every September after. He had not used the cistern's water for drinking. The well handled the house. He had used it for barn washing, for the stock tank in July and August, when the well pressure dropped, for the garden in dry summers. He had maintained it as his father had maintained it, without drama and without full understanding of what his father had meant when he said the well was reliable, but the cistern was certain. In August of 1988, he understood it. Let me tell you about the physics of why the 1988 drought affected Dale's well and not Ray's cistern, because the mechanism is the hidden advantage, and it is worth understanding precisely. Dale's 1948 drilled well drew from the shallow aquifer, a layer of water-bearing sand and gravel sitting at 40 to 45 feet depth in the Monroe County geology. The shallow aquifer is recharged primarily by surface rainfall percolating through the soil. In a normal year, with adequate seasonal rainfall, the shallow aquifer maintains its water level within a few feet of its historical average. In a drought year, when surface rainfall drops by 50 to 60% over 3 or 4 months, the percolation that recharges the shallow aquifer slows and eventually stops. The water level in the aquifer drops, slowly at first, then faster as the deficit accumulates. By August 3rd in 1988, the water level in Dale's shallow aquifer had dropped below the intake of his pump at 42 feet. The pump was pulling air. The well was dry. Ray's drilled well drew from the deeper limestone aquifer at 86 feet. The limestone aquifer is recharged differently from the shallow aquifer. It receives water through fractures and solution channels in the bedrock that move water from a much larger recharge area than the surface acreage directly above the well. It is slower to drop in a drought and slower to recover. By August 9th, the water level in the limestone aquifer under the Feltner farm had dropped 8 feet, enough to pull the pump intake above the water surface. Ray's well had also failed, just 6 days after Dale's. The cistern operated on a completely different principle. It was not a well at all. It did not depend on the aquifer, shallow or deep. It collected surface runoff from the barn roof. Rain that fell during the wet months of the year filtered through the settling box and held in the brick vault for use in the dry months. Its water supply was determined not by the current drought, but by the previous wet season. The spring of 1988 had been close to normal rainfall in Monroe County. The cistern had filled to within 2 feet of capacity in April. When the drought began in June, the cistern's 14,000 gallons were already in the vault, already filtered, already behind the brick walls. The drought could not reach them because the drought happened after the collection. This is what Amos had understood in 1922, and what he had expressed in one sentence. A farm that cannot hold its rain cannot farm through a dry summer. You cannot collect rain when you need it. You collect it when it falls, and you hold it for when you need it. A well depends on the water being there when you call for it. A cistern depends on the water being there because you caught it when you had the chance. Dale's well had been reliable for 40 years because the aquifer had been adequate for 40 years. In the 41st year, it was not adequate. He had no alternative because he had filled in the alternative in 1971 for the convenience of parking a tractor. Ray's well had also been reliable for 40 years and was also not adequate in the 41st year. But Ray had an alternative because his grandfather had built it in 1922 and his father had kept it and Ray had kept it. The alternative held 14,000 gallons when the well failed, and it held enough to carry 60 head of cattle and a household through 40 days of the worst drought Monroe County had seen since 1930. Let me tell you about the conversations that happened during those 40 days, because they complete the story's human accounting. Dale had driven to Ray's farm on August 11th, 2 days after Ray's well failed. He had seen Ray at the barn lot checking the stock tank level. He had stopped the truck. Dale said, "I heard your well is out." Ray said, "Since the 9th." Dale said, "You're hauling from Ellettsville." Ray said, "No." He looked at the barn. He said, "I'm on the cistern." Dale was quiet for a moment. He said, "Amos's old cistern." Ray said, "Still there." He paused. "Had 14,000 gallons when the well went out." Dale looked at the barn corner, where the red-lidded cover was visible above grade. He said, "How long will that carry you?" Ray said, "At current draw through mid-September." He looked at Dale. "If the rain comes when they say it will, I'll be fine." Dale said, "I'm hauling 800 gallons a day from Ellettsville." Ray said, "I know." Dale said nothing for a moment. He looked at the cistern cover. He said, "I filled mine in. 71. He paused. "You told me not to." Ray said, "I didn't tell you not to. I told you I was keeping mine." Dale said, "Same thing." He looked at Ray. "How much water do you have to spare?" Ray thought about it. The 40 days were going to be close. He had cattle, a small hog operation, and the household on the cistern. He had calculated his draw at 250 gallons per day. With 14,000 gallons, he had 56 days of draw at that rate, and the rain was forecast in 40 days. He had margin, not a lot, but real margin. He said, "I can let you have 500 gallons a week." He paused. "You fill a tank trailer from the yard hydrant twice a week." He looked at Dale. "That gets you through until the rain." Dale had said, "What do I owe you?" Ray had said, "Nothing." He paused. "Clean your end of the road culverts in October." He looked at Dale. "That's what I was going to ask you to help with anyway." Dale had said, "Done." He had driven home. He had come with the tank trailer twice a week for 6 weeks, filling from Ray's yard hydrant that ran from the cistern. The 500 gallons per week had not been the difference between Dale making it and not making it. He was still hauling from Ellettsville for the majority of his water, but it had cut his Ellettsville trips by roughly a third and had given his cattle better quality water than the standpipe produced. On September 17th, the first significant rain of the fall arrived in Monroe County, 2¼ inches over 2 days. The cistern, which had been drawn down to approximately 4,000 gallons, began filling. By September 22nd, it had recovered to 9,000 gallons. Ray cleaned the cistern in late September that year, as he did every year. He inspected the brick lining. He found one section of mortar near the water line that had softened and replaced it. He flushed the settling box. He checked the inlet screen and the cover seal. He wrote in the farm notebook. Cistern held through the 1988 drought. 40 days, August 9th to September 17th, approximately 10,000 gallons drawn, 4,000 remaining at end, no livestock lost, no water hauled. Will repair mortar course 8 from bottom, 3 bricks on northwest quadrant. Grandfather's construction held. He put the cover back on. He went inside. Let me tell you what Amos had understood about water that the 1922 season had taught him, and that the 1988 season taught Ray, because the understanding is larger than the cistern and larger than any single drought. Water security on a farm is not about having the best primary system. The drilled well at 86 feet was a better primary system than the brick cistern in almost every way that matters in a normal year. More reliable yield, cooler and cleaner water, lower maintenance, longer service life. In 40 years between 1948 and 1988, the drilled well had delivered on every one of those advantages. Ray would not have traded the well for the cistern as his primary source. The cistern's value was not in competition with the well. Its value was in the specific quality of being different from the well. Different collection mechanism, different storage, different failure mode. The well failed when the aquifer dropped. The cistern held what it had already collected and was immune to aquifer conditions. These two systems, different in every technical detail, failed at different times and under different conditions. Having both meant having coverage across a wider range of failure scenarios than either one alone could provide. This is not a complicated idea. It is the same idea that runs through every story about the farmer who kept the old drill alongside the new planter, who kept the smokehouse alongside the chest freezer, who kept the hand-dug well alongside the rural water line. The old system and the new system fail differently. Having both means failing less often in total. Amos had arrived at this understanding by watching his dug well fail in 1922 while his neighbor's rain barrel, a crude version of the same collection principle, had provided enough water to keep the neighbor's kitchen garden alive through August. He had decided to build a better version of the same principle at a scale that could carry his livestock rather than just his garden. He had built it to last because he expected to need it more than once in his farming years. He had needed it once. The 1934 drought had also drawn the well down, though not to failure, and the cistern had supplemented through August that year as well. He had needed it vicariously in 1988, when his grandson found it still holding 14,000 gallons, 66 years after the last brick was laid. Subscribe to The Honest Farmer for more stories like this one. Stories of the structures built to hold what the sky gives freely and deliver it in the months the sky gives nothing. Of the grandfathers who built in brick because they expected it to be needed more than once and wanted it to be ready more than once. of the neighbors who filled in the alternative and spent 6 weeks hauling from a standpipe 12 miles away. Hit the bell. Tell me in the comments, does your farm still have a cistern? Is it still connected? The Feltner cistern is still in the ground at the northwest corner of the barn. The brick lining is intact. Ray's son inspected it in 2018 and found the mortar sound, except for one small section near the inlet that he repaired with hydraulic cement on a Saturday afternoon. The red wooden cover has been replaced once since Ray's father painted it in 1955. The inlet tile from the barn downspout runs through the stone settling box the same way Amos built it. The cistern collects rain every spring. It holds what it collects. It gives it back when the well cannot. Amos said, "A farm that cannot hold its rain cannot farm through a dry summer." He said it in 1922. Ray heard it in 1988. Ray's son repaired the mortar in 2018 without being asked. The cistern will be there for whatever dry summer comes next. It has been there for every dry summer since 1922. It will be there for the next one. That is what brick and lime and Portland cement built by a man who expected to need it more than once looks like after 100 years. It looks like 14,000 gallons waiting quietly behind a red wooden cover on a concrete collar in the northwest corner of the barn. Let me tell you about how Amos managed the cistern's water quality, because a brick-lined underground tank full of collected rainwater is only useful if the water coming out of it is safe for livestock and household use. And Amos had given this as much thought as the construction itself. The first problem with collected rainwater is contamination from the roof surface. A barn roof accumulates bird droppings, leaf debris, dust, insect material, and whatever drifts in on the wind between rain events. The first flush of rain off any roof carries the highest concentration of this material. Amos had built the settling box precisely to intercept this material. The gravel and sand filter removed suspended solids from the incoming water before it entered the cistern vault. But he had also cut a small wooden baffle into the inlet pipe inside the settling box, a hinged flap that stayed closed while the first several gallons of runoff, the dirtiest flush, filled the settling box chamber above the baffle, and only opened to pass water into the cistern once the initial flush was through. The baffle had been his own design, copied from a description he had read in a farm management bulletin from the Indiana State Board of Agriculture. The second problem is algae and biological growth inside the cistern. A water-filled underground chamber that receives periodic inputs of organic material from the roof can develop algae blooms and bacterial growth if it is not maintained. Amos had addressed this in two ways. First, the waterproof lime plaster on the interior walls released a small amount of calcium hydroxide into the water continuously, maintaining a mildly alkaline pH that suppressed algae. Second, he had specified the September cleaning, the annual emptying and scrubbing and inspection that Ray's father had continued and that Ray had continued, to remove any biological growth before it could establish. 4 hours every September, keeping the interior clean enough that the water drawn from it was safe for livestock and filtered through a charcoal pitcher filter Amos's wife had kept on the kitchen counter, safe for household use in emergencies. The well had made the emergency household use unnecessary after 1948, but the annual cleaning had continued, The water quality in the cistern in 1988 was, by Ray's assessment from the smell and the clarity on the measuring tape float, as good as it had been in any year he could remember. 66 years of September cleanings had kept it that way. Let me also tell you what the cistern's collection rate meant in practical terms during the 1988 drought, because understanding the math of roof collection explains why 14,000 gallons was not as thin a margin as it might sound. The barn roof was approximately 3,200 square feet of corrugated metal roofing. 1 inch of rainfall on 3,200 square feet produces at approximately 0.623 gallons per square foot per inch of rain, approximately 1,993 gallons, call it 2,000 gallons per inch of rain, accounting for the settling box filter that passes about 95% of incoming water. Between August 9th and September 17th, the 40 days of Ray's well failure, Monroe County received approximately 0.8 inches of rainfall in scattered light events that were too small to break the drought, but were enough to contribute to the cistern. 0.8 inches on the barn roof produced approximately 1,600 gallons of additional collection during the drought itself. This reduced Ray's effective draw on the starting 14,000 gallons by 1,600, meaning his actual net draw from stored reserves was approximately 8,400 gallons, rather than 10,000, with the remaining 1,600 coming from the drought period collection. This is the specific compounding advantage of a collection system. Even during a drought, when rainfall is severely reduced, the collection system gathers whatever falls. The 0.8 inches that fell over 40 drought days was insufficient to recharge the aquifer or break the drought in any meaningful sense, but it was enough to contribute 1,600 gallons to a cistern that was already there to receive it. The cistern was catching rain when it fell, even when it barely fell, in exactly the way Amos had said a farm should. Let me also tell you about the summer of 1934 in Monroe County, because 1988 was not the first time Amos's cistern had been needed, and understanding the 1934 event completes the pattern. Ray had found the reference in his father's farm notebook when he was going through the farm records after the 1988 drought. His father had made an entry in September 1934. Drought summer, well yield reduced to half, used cistern heavily July and August. Cistern ran to approximately 3,000 gallons by September 1st before the rains came. No livestock lost. Amos's structure held. The 1934 entry had 2 additional notes in the margin. The first said, Amos checked the brick lining after the drought drawdown, found 2 courses in the bottom quadrant with softened mortar, repointed both courses with new Portland cement. The second said, neighbor Addison filled in his cistern in 1929, when the county said to hauled water from Harrodsburg all of August 1934, 42 miles each way. Ray had read this entry in October 1988, a month after his own drought had ended. He had sat with the notebook for a while. 2 droughts, 66 years apart, the same brick vault, the same September inspection, the same note about the neighbor who had filled theirs in and hauled water from a distance while the Feltner farm had drawn from the cistern. The pattern ran from 1922 through 1934 through 1988. Amos had built it for 1922. It had been available for 1934. Ray had maintained it for 1988. His son had repaired the mortar in 2018 for whatever drought comes after. Every time the well failed or was inadequate, the cistern was there. Every time a neighbor filled in their cistern, they lost coverage for a drought year they could not predict. The pattern was consistent, and it had been consistent for 100 years. Amos had said the sentence once. He had not needed to say it more than once because the cistern kept saying it for him every time a dry summer came to Monroe County. The cistern is a farm that holds its rain. A farm that holds its rain can farm through a dry summer. That sentence has been true in Monroe County since 1922. It will be true in the next dry summer, whenever it comes, for the farm on which a brick-lined vault stands in the northwest corner of the barn with a red wooden cover on a concrete collar and a stone settling box, taking whatever the barn roof delivers and holding it quietly for the morning when the kitchen tap produces only air. Let me tell you about what Ray told his son about the cistern's maintenance after the 1988 drought. Because the conversation that happened that September is the one that carries the inheritance forward. Ray's son, Marcus, was 22 in 1988, working the farm alongside Ray and beginning to take on more of the daily operation. He had watched the drought play out from the inside, had been the one to check the cistern level twice a week, had been present when Dale drove up with the tank trailer the first time, had helped run the hose from the yard hydrant to fill it. He had seen the specifics. He had seen his father do nothing to manage the water crisis while Dale was driving to Ellettsville. In September, when the rain had come and the cistern was recovering and Ray was doing the annual cleaning, Marcus had climbed down into the cistern alongside him. It was the first time he had been inside it. He had been too young when Ray had started letting him help with farm tasks, and the cistern cleaning had always been Ray's solo September work. He had looked at the brick walls in the headlamp light. He had run his hand along the lime-plastered surface. He had looked at the mortar courses, some of them the original 1922 Portland cement work that Amos had laid, some of them the repointing work from 1934 and from Ray's father's years, and from Ray's own corrections. He had said, "This is 66 years old." Ray had said, "It was built to hold longer than that." He had his brush on the mortar course he was inspecting. He said, "Your great-grandfather laid these bricks before your grandfather was 20 years old." Marcus had been quiet for a moment. He said, "Dale's well was dry for 29 days. Ray said, "Yes." Marcus said, "We never hauled." Ray said, "No." Marcus said, "Because of this." Ray said, "Yes." He looked at his son. 4 hours every September. He said, "That is what it costs to be certain you will not haul." Marcus had looked at the brick walls again. He said, "How long will it last?" Ray said, "If we keep cleaning it every year and repair the mortar when it softens, there is no reason it cannot hold for another 100 years." He paused. "The bricks are as sound as they were in 1922. Portland cement in a protected environment does not deteriorate quickly." He looked at the water line. "The lime plaster needs attention every 15 to 20 years?" He paused. "Your grandfather put on a new coat in 1960. It is due again." Marcus said, "I'll do it." Ray looked at his son. He said, "I know you will." They had finished the cleaning together that September. Marcus had done the annual cleaning every September since then, alone after Ray retired from active farming in 2001. In 2018, he had applied a new coat of waterproof lime plaster to the interior walls. The first new plaster coat since 1960, 58 years between applications, the structure sound enough that it had not been needed sooner. He had repaired the softened mortar on the northwest quadrant that same Saturday. He had written in his own farm notebook, in the section he kept for the cistern, "Mortar repaired northwest quadrant. New lime plaster coat applied. Brick lining structurally intact. Estimated capacity 15,800 gallons. Inlet screen replaced. Settling box gravel replenished." He had put the red cover back on the concrete collar. He had gone inside. The cistern is in its 102nd year of operation. It will be in its 103rd year next September when Marcus cleans it again. Whatever dry summer follows, whatever aquifer drawdown that summer produces in Monroe County's limestone aquifer, the cistern will have been cleaned and inspected and ready. Amos said the sentence in 1922 and never needed to repeat it. The cistern has been repeating it every dry summer since. It will keep repeating it as long as someone lifts the red cover in September and puts in the 4 hours. That is what brick and lime and the specific deliberateness of a man who watched his well fail in 1922 and decided not to watch it fail again without recourse. That is what it looks like after 102 years. It looks like 14,000 gallons in August. It looks like not hauling. It looks like the farm that holds its rain.